From now on, you're no longer a part of this family. Don't ever call us again." That was the voicemail I received at exactly 7:26 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday in October. I was standing in the cold, flickering fluorescent light of the backstage hallway of the hospital where I work. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a forensic finance investigator for several major medical funds here in Chicago. My entire career is built on tracking down missing money, identifying deep-rooted financial fraud, and dismantling complex webs of lies that people spin to cover their tracks. I literally look at bank statements and tax returns all day to catch people in their own deception. You would think my own family would remember what I do for a living before trying to play high-stakes games with me. But ego is a dangerous, blinding thing. It makes supposedly smart people do incredibly stupid things. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to my mother, Margaret Whitmore. She didn't sound angry, which was honestly the worst part of it all. If she had been screaming or crying, I could have just brushed it off as another one of her classic, theatrical tantrums. But she wasn't. Her tone was completely cold, calculated, and dripping with open contempt. She delivered those words like a Supreme Court judge handing down an unappealable sentence. She was officially cutting me off. Why? Because earlier that afternoon, I had asked a very simple, standard question about a massive financial document she wanted me to blindly sign. I didn't even refuse to sign it. I literally just asked for basic clarification on where a specific pool of money was coming from. But for my mother, a woman who ruled the wealthy Chicago charity scene with an iron fist and a perfectly practiced fake smile, being questioned by her own daughter was the ultimate disrespect. In her mind, she was the undisputed queen of our family, and I was just the hired help who happened to share her DNA. Let me give you some quick context about the Whitmore family, so you understand the joke of it all. From the outside, we looked like absolute royalty. We had the last name, the country club memberships, the connections, and the flawless appearances. My mother was always splashed across the local society pages, hosting extravagant galas, kissing babies and cutting ribbons. My father, Daniel Whitmore, played the role of the successful, stoic businessman perfectly, always wearing bespoke suits and talking loudly about market trends. My younger sister, Clara, lived a life of absolute, unchecked luxury. She had never worked a day in her life, but funded a lifestyle of designer bags, spontaneous trips to Milan, and five-star dinners, treating her credit cards like magic plastic that never actually needed to be paid off. But I knew the ugly truth. Because for the last 10 years, I was the one holding the entire illusion together. Behind closed doors, my father's business was a sinking ship. He was secretly drowning in a mountain of debt that he was desperately trying to shuffle around from account to account before it crushed him entirely. Clara's credit cards were maxed out, and she was dodging collection calls between her spa appointments. And my mother, she was so deeply obsessed with maintaining her public image as a wealthy philanthropist that she was currently engineering the most ridiculous, high-risk financial stunt of her entire life. They were in the middle of selling our old family mansion, a massive, outdated property valued at $6.4 million. But instead of using that money to pay off my father's hidden debts or secure a quiet, safe future for their retirement, my mother was doubling down on the facade. She had signed a contract to buy a breathtaking, ultra-luxury penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. On top of that, just to make sure her name stayed in the headlines for the upcoming gala season, she had publicly committed a $2 million donation to a high-end senior care fund. To make it even worse, she was using my grandmother, Eleanor Grant, as her emotional prop for this donation. Grandma Eleanor is a sweet, quiet woman, and my mother paraded her around like a show dog to get sympathy and applause from the charity board. It was a classic shell game. They were moving money from one place to another before anyone realized the vaults were actually empty, but there was one massive, fatal flaw in my mother's grand plan. A detail she completely overlooked in her absolute arrogance when she left me that voicemail telling me to never call them again, that I was the financial linchpin of the entire family. Every single one of those pending transactions, the sale of the $6.4 million mansion, the purchase of a Lake Michigan penthouse, and the $2 million charity pledge, relied entirely on my financial credentials. Over the years, because my credit was flawless, my background checks were spotless, and my income was rock solid, they had slowly guilt-tripped me into co-signing, verifying, and legally backing almost every major financial move they made. I was the guarantor. I was the proof of funds. I was the safety net that allowed them to live millions of dollars beyond their actual reality. Standing in that hospital hallway, listening to the voicemail click and end, I didn't cry. A few years ago, maybe I would have. I probably would have panicked, called her back frantically, begged for forgiveness, and asked what I needed to do to make it right. That was the toxic dynamic she was used to. She pushes me away. I scrambled to fix things to earn my way back in, but I was 36 years old now. I spent my days analyzing raw data, looking at hard facts, and holding actual criminals accountable for their actions. I was exhausted. I was so incredibly tired of being the only functioning adult in a family of children who were playing dress-up with millions of dollars they didn't actually have. She said I was no longer a part of the family. She explicitly instructed me not to contact them again. Okay. I decided to grant her wish that I didn't call her back. I drove home to my quiet apartment, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and went to sleep. I slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I woke up, poured a cup of black coffee, opened my laptop and went to work. Not my hospital work. My personal work. I did 3 very simple, very deliberate things. I didn't do them out of spite, or blind anger, or a petty desire for revenge. I did them strictly as a professional adjusting to a brand new reality. If I was no longer part of the family, I could no longer be legally or financially entangled in their affairs. It was just basic liability management. First, I logged into the banking portals and completely withdrew my financial verification rights for the Whitmore estate. I removed my income statements, my spotless credit history, and my asset portfolio from their active profiles. Second, I drafted formal legal notices and immediately canceled my legal signature on every single pending document. I formally revoked my status as a guarantor for the Lake Michigan penthouse escrow. Third, I sent brief, highly professional emails to the family lawyer, the real estate brokers handling the mansion, and the banks, formally notifying them that I was no longer associated with the Whitmore family finances and that my assets could absolutely not be used to secure any of their current or future transactions. I didn't leave a dramatic note. I didn't send a threatening text to my mother. I didn't warn my father that the floor was about to fall out from under him. I didn't engage in any screaming matches with my sister. I literally just followed my mother's exact instructions. I stopped contacting them. I simply unplugged myself from their elaborate, fake system and walked away. They wanted to live without me. Now, they were going to have to finance that luxurious life without me, too. I closed my laptop, took a deep breath, and got dressed for my actual job that I knew it wouldn't take long for them to notice. In the high-end financial world, when the foundational asset is suddenly pulled out, the house doesn't slowly settle. It collapses instantly. I figured it would take maybe a day or 2 for them to realize what had happened, that I was wrong. The financial system is highly automated these days, especially when large escrows and millions of dollars are involved. It didn't take days. It took exactly 3 hours for the dominoes to start falling, and when they did, the noise was deafening. I told you that in the high-end financial world, things collapse instantly when the foundational asset is pulled out. I was not exaggerating. It took exactly 3 hours for everything to start blowing up, that I knew exactly how this was going to play out because I am a forensic finance investigator, and I literally dismantle these kinds of fragile financial structures for a living. When you're dealing with millions of dollars in real estate and charitable pledges, you aren't dealing with forgiving human beings who will give you a grace period. You're dealing with automated risk assessment algorithms. When I logged into the portals that morning and formally removed my financial verification, my spotless credit history, and my solid asset portfolio from my family's profiles, I triggered an immediate automated red flag across 3 different major institutions to exactly 11:14 a.m. The first domino fell. The bank officially froze the escrow account for the Lake Michigan penthouse. Let me explain how this works in plain English. My parents were trying to buy an ultra-luxury penthouse while simultaneously selling our old family mansion, which was supposedly valued at $6.4 million. To do that, they needed a massive bridge loan to hold the penthouse while they waited for the mansion's sale to close. But my father, Daniel Whitmore, has terrible hidden debt, and my mother, Margaret, has no actual verifiable income outside of her society events. The bank only approved that bridge loan because I was listed as the primary financial guarantor. The absolute second my formal withdrawal letter hit the bank system, their compliance software realized the bridge loan was completely unsecured. The bank froze the escrow immediately. 10 minutes later, the second domino dropped. Because the escrow was frozen and the required funds were suddenly missing in action, the real estate brokerage representing the sellers of the Lake Michigan penthouse automatically suspended the purchase contract. The sellers were immediately notified that the Whitmore family was in breach of contract due to insufficient funds. Just like that, my mother's dream of hosting lavish parties overlooking the water was put on indefinite hold, but the third domino was the one that I knew would absolutely destroy my mother's ego. By 1:30 p.m., the compliance office of the High-End Senior Care Fund reached out to my parents. My mother had publicly promised a $2 million donation to this facility, using my sweet grandmother, Eleanor Grant, as the emotional face of the campaign. Charity boards at that level do not play around with unverified pledges. They rely on proof of funds to allocate their budgets. When my financial backing disappeared from the family trust profile, the nursing home's financial director immediately demanded new proof of financial standing from my parents. They were caught. The money wasn't there, the safety net was gone, and the institutions were demanding answers. And that is when my phone started ringing. Over the next 24 hours, my personal cell phone became an absolute war zone. I received exactly 43 missed calls. I also received 19 text messages and 7 urgent emails. I sat at my desk at the hospital, sipping my coffee, and simply watched the notifications roll in on my lock screen. That IT was a fascinating psychological study. The very same people who had confidently told me just hours earlier to never contact them again were now frantically trying to hunt me down. The tone of their messages shifted dramatically as the reality of the situation slowly dawned on them. The 19 text messages were mostly from my younger sister, Clara, and my father. Clara's texts started off completely oblivious and purely selfish. Her first message at noon simply read, "My black card just got declined at Neiman Marcus. Did you mess with the accounts again? Fix it." She actually thought I was just doing routine maintenance. By 3 p.m., her texts became frantic. "Elena, seriously, the bank says the accounts are locked. Call me right now." By 5 p.m., she was spiraling into pure panic because the reality of her luxurious lifestyle, which she funded entirely through our family's money, was suddenly vanishing. That my father's texts were different. Daniel Whitmore always tried to play the role of the stoic, authoritative businessman, even when he was drowning in secret debt. His messages were short, aggressive, and demanding. "Call your mother immediately. Whatever game you are playing with the bank, end it now. You are embarrassing this family. Pick up the phone." He was trying to command me to fix the situation, completely ignoring the fact that I had formally severed all ties with his mess. And my mother, Margaret? She didn't text at all. She just called, over and over and over again. She left frantic voicemails, her cold, calculated tone from the night before completely replaced by a shrill, hyperventilating panic. The woman who had proudly stated I was no longer a part of the family was now leaving audio messages saying, "This needs to be fixed right now." She didn't apologize. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just demanded that I put the safety net back under her before everyone in her wealthy charity circle found out she was actually broke. That I didn't answer a single one of the 43 calls. I didn't reply to a single one of the 19 texts. I deleted the 7 urgent emails without even reading past the subject lines. I had followed her instructions perfectly. I was not contacting them, but then, at 9 a.m. the following morning, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID didn't say Margaret, Daniel, or Clara. IT said Robert Langford. Robert Langford was the longtime family lawyer. He was an incredibly sharp, incredibly expensive attorney who handled all the legal paperwork for the Whitmore estate. Unlike my family, Robert actually understood the law, and more importantly, he understood liability. If Robert was calling me directly, it meant the banks and the real estate brokers had formally notified him that the financial foundation of his clients had completely evaporated. I actually liked Robert. He was a professional. So, for the first time in 24 hours, I pressed the green button and answered the phone. "Elena," Robert's voice came through the speaker. He didn't bother with small talk. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just sighed heavily into the receiver. "We have a serious situation." "Good morning, Robert," I replied calmly, leaning back in my office chair. I kept my voice completely flat and professional. I assume you received the formal legal notices I sent over regarding my withdrawal as the financial guarantor for the Whitmore estate. I received them, Robert said, his tone tight and strained. Elena, the penthouse sellers are threatening to sue for breach of contract. The bank has frozen the bridge loan, and the charity board is breathing down your mother's neck about the $2 million pledge. Your parents are currently sitting in my office in an absolute panic. They are telling me this is just a temporary misunderstanding. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course, they were lying to their own lawyer. They were so deeply embedded in their own fake reality that they couldn't even tell the man trying to save them the truth. It's not a misunderstanding, Robert, I said clearly. My mother officially cut me out of the family 2 days ago. I am simply removing my personal, verified assets from their extremely high-risk, completely unfunded transactions. As a forensic finance investigator, I cannot legally or ethically have my name attached to a massive financial shell game. You understand that? Robert let out another heavy breath. He knew exactly what my parents were doing, even if he legally couldn't say it out loud to me. He knew they didn't have the money. He knew I was the only thing keeping the entire illusion afloat. Elena, Robert started carefully, trying to navigate the impossible position he was in. Your mother has made certain public declarations. She has made commitments under the assumption that your financial backing was still firmly in place. I stopped spinning in my chair. I sat up perfectly straight, my eyes narrowing at the wall of my office. My brain immediately switched into full investigator mode. Robert wasn't just talking about the bank. He was talking about other people. He was talking about the charity board and the real estate brokers. Robert, I asked, my voice suddenly dropping to a dangerous, dead serious whisper. Who did they tell that I was still handling this? Through the phone line, all I could hear was the faint, muffled sound of Chicago traffic outside of Robert's office window. He didn't answer right away. As a lawyer, he was quickly calculating what he was legally allowed to tell me versus what he morally needed to warn me about. The silence lasted exactly 6 seconds, and in those 6 agonizing seconds, I realized that this was no longer just about me walking away from a toxic family. This was about my mother actively using my professional name to commit fraud. Those 6 seconds of silence stretching across the phone line told me absolutely everything I needed to know. Robert Langford was a man who billed $1,000 an hour. He didn't waste time on dramatic pauses unless the news he was about to deliver was legally catastrophic. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, carefully stripped of any personal emotion. Elena, your mother didn't just leave your name on the internal bank documents. She has been actively leveraging your professional credentials to secure these deals. She explicitly told the charity board, the real estate brokers, and the financial directors at the nursing home that you were personally overseeing the entire transaction. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against my temples. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. Here is the crucial context that makes this so incredibly toxic. Yes, I had formally submitted the legal paperwork to sever my financial ties just yesterday morning. But the reality is, I had actually stepped away from this specific, disastrous financial circus 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks prior, I had sat my parents down in their living room, looked at the raw numbers for the mansion sale and the penthouse purchase, and told them flat out that the math was entirely fictional. I told them I would not actively manage a deal built on phantom equity. That was the exact conversation that had bruised my mother's massive ego and ultimately led to her leaving me that unhinged voicemail telling me I was out of the family. She knew I was out. My father knew I was out. But instead of adjusting their plans, my mother simply smiled at the high society charity board and the luxury real estate brokers and lied right to their faces. She sold them a completely fabricated narrative, assuring them that her brilliant, forensic finance investigator daughter was diligently managing every single penny behind the scenes. She used my spotless professional reputation as a human shield for her massive, reckless fraud. It gets worse, Robert said, pulling me out of my thoughts. I honestly didn't know how it could possibly get worse than my mother actively committing fraud in my name, but Robert always delivered. Margaret has already started sending out save-the-date invitations for the upcoming charity gala season. I frowned, staring blindly at my computer screen. Invitations to what, Robert? They don't have the money to host a gala. She is telling everyone that the Whitmore family will be hosting an exclusive, high-profile charity gala at the New Lake, Michigan penthouse next month, Robert replied, his tone dripping with professional despair. She has invited major donors, local politicians, and the entire board of the senior care fund. Elena, she is selling tickets to an event at a multi-million-dollar property that she does not own, cannot afford, and is currently locked out of because the bank froze the escrow. My jaw literally dropped. It was a reputation bomb of epic proportions. My mother was so deeply addicted to the applause, the status, and the validation of the Chicago elite that she was willing to drive a burning car right off a cliff, convinced she could somehow magically fly before she hit the ground. She was planning to host a glamorous party in a penthouse that was literally slipping through her fingers as we spoke. "Have you told her?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Have you told my mother that the sellers are threatening to sue and the bank has frozen the money?" "I am trying," Robert said, sounding genuinely exhausted. "But your mother is currently sitting in my conference room insisting that this is just a minor clerical error on your part. She is demanding that I force you to put your verification back into the system. She absolutely refuses to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Because she thinks I will cave," I said flatly. "She thinks if she ignores the problem long enough, the pressure will break me, and I will step in and clean up her mess just to avoid the public embarrassment. That's how it has always worked." "Elena, what do you want me to do?" Robert asked. "Legally, I have to inform the brokers and the charity board that you are no longer involved. But the moment I do that, the illusion shatters entirely. The sellers will terminate the contract, the charity will publicly revoke the pledge, and the fallout will be immediate and incredibly messy." And right there, in the middle of my quiet office, the reality of my situation finally crystallized into a sharp, dangerous point. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This wasn't just me setting boundaries and walking away from toxic parents. This was a direct, existential threat to my livelihood that I am a forensic finance investigator. My entire career relies on absolute, unshakable integrity. I handle millions of dollars in sensitive medical funds. If these high-end brokers, bank managers, and charity board members believed I was secretly orchestrating this fraudulent shell game for my parents, my professional reputation would be completely destroyed. If the Whitmore family went down in a massive, very public financial scandal, and my name was attached to it, I wouldn't just lose my job. I could lose my license. I could face investigations. I could be blacklisted in the financial sector forever that my mother, in her desperate bid to keep her fake crown, had strapped a bomb to my career. "Tell them the truth, Robert," I said firmly, all the hesitation vanishing from my voice. "You have my formal, legal withdrawal. Do your job and inform the necessary parties that I am not, and have not been, involved in securing these transactions." "Are you sure?" Robert asked quietly. "Once I make those calls, there is no going back. It will be a total collapse." "I'm sure," I replied. "I'll handle my end." I hung up the phone and immediately went to work. But this time, I wasn't doing my family's dirty work. I was treating my own family like one of my corporate fraud suspects. I shifted my mindset from a tired daughter to a lead investigator building a rock-solid case file that I opened a secure folder on my personal drive. I started meticulously gathering every single piece of evidence I could find to prove my total lack of involvement in my mother's disastrous schemes. I took screenshots of the automated bank logs showing the exact timestamp. I removed my financial backing. I exported the formal cancellation notices I had sent to Robert. I pulled up the exact dates and times from 2 weeks ago when I had officially logged out of the family's shared financial portals. Most importantly, I saved the voicemail. The audio file of my mother's cold, arrogant voice telling me, "From now on, you are no longer a part of this family. Don't ever call us again." That single audio clip was the ultimate proof. It was her explicitly cutting me out, confirming that I had zero authority or involvement in their affairs from that moment forward, that I organized the emails, the frantic text messages from my sister Clara and my father, and the records of the 43 missed calls into a clear, chronological timeline. I backed everything up to an external drive. I was building a defensive wall made of hard data and undeniable facts. Let my mother spin her lies to the charity board. Let my father yell at the bank. I had the paper trail that I knew my mother's playbook. When the walls finally closed in, she would never take the blame. She would point her perfectly manicured finger directly at me and tell the world that I had ruined everything. She was going to try and make me the villain of her spectacular downfall, but I was ready. I had the evidence, I had the truth, and I was absolutely done being the Whitmore family's safety net. The dominoes were falling, and I was going to make sure I was standing far, far away when the final crash happened. 3 days passed. After the initial barrage of 43 missed calls, the frantic texts from Clara, and the aggressive demands from my father, my phone finally fell into an eerie, heavy silence. They had stopped trying to reach me. At first, you might think they had suddenly developed a conscience or realized the error of their ways. But I knew my family too well. The silence didn't mean they were giving up. It meant they were pivoting. My mother, Margaret Whitmore, was entering survival mode. And her version of survival always involved rewriting history and finding a convenient scapegoat. That scapegoat was me. The showdown happened exactly 3 days after my conversation with Robert Langford, the family lawyer. It went down on a Friday night at a massive, highly publicized charity gala hosted at the Conservatory Hall in downtown Chicago. For those unfamiliar with the Chicago charity circuit, the Conservatory Hall is the absolute pinnacle of high society events. We are talking towering glass ceilings, imported exotic orchids on every table, champagne that costs more than a used car, and a guest list packed with wealthy donors, local politicians, the local press, and the entire executive board of the high-end senior care fund that I wasn't officially invited, of course. But I didn't need an invitation. I still had my elite access credentials from years of being the invisible financial architect behind these exact types of events. I decided to show up. I didn't go because I wanted a dramatic, cinematic revenge moment. I went because my professional reputation as a forensic finance investigator was actively on the line. My mother was using my name to secure fraudulent millions. I needed to publicly and surgically amputate my career from her sinking ship in front of the exact people she was lying to. I walked into the grand ballroom around 8:30 p.m. The room was a sea of custom tuxedos and designer evening gowns. The clinking of crystal glasses and the soft hum of a live string quartet echoed through the massive space. I wore a simple, tailored black suit. I wasn't there to party. I was there to conduct an audit that it didn't take me long to find her. Margaret Whitmore was in her element, standing near the center of the room, completely surrounded by a tight circle of the most important people at the event. I recognized the faces immediately. There was the regional director of the bank, the head of the luxury real estate brokerage handling the penthouse, and the primary board members of the senior care fund. She was holding a flute of champagne, wearing a stunning emerald dress, and holding court as I quietly approached the edge of the circle, slipping behind a towering floral arrangement. I could hear her voice carrying over the music. She was doing exactly what I predicted. She was playing the tragic, long-suffering victim. It has just been incredibly difficult for Daniel and me. My mother was sighing softly, pressing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest. We had everything perfectly aligned for the new penthouse and the $2 million pledge to your wonderful facility. But my daughter, Elena, well, it breaks a mother's heart to say it, but she has become an incredibly ungrateful daughter. Right at the finish line, she just abandoned the family. She walked away from her responsibilities and left us scrambling to manage the final paperwork. The delays you are seeing with the bank are entirely because of her sudden, spiteful refusal to do her job. There it was, the grand lie. She was blaming the frozen escrow, the missing money, and the collapsed deals entirely on my supposed emotional instability. She was telling the most powerful people in Chicago that I had maliciously sabotaged a multi-million-dollar charity donation. I didn't wait for the board members to offer their sympathetic murmurs. I didn't wait for her to spin another lie. I just stepped out from behind the flowers and walked directly into the center of the circle. I didn't make a scene. I didn't cause a loud commotion. I didn't yell or scream or throw a drink. I just stood there in the room, perfectly calm, looking directly into my mother's eyes. The temperature in that small circle seemed to drop by 10 degrees in a single second. My mother's mouth froze mid-sentence. Her eyes widened, completely terrified, as she stared at the daughter she had just been throwing under the bus. "You said I abandoned the family," I said, my voice completely level and conversational, yet loud enough for every single executive and donor in that circle to hear. "But you told me not to contact you anymore." Margaret literally choked on her breath. She took a step back, her champagne sloshing over the rim of her crystal glass and staining her emerald dress. She tried to force a laugh, a desperate, high-pitched sound of panic. "Elena, darling, this really isn't the time or the place. I think it's exactly the time and the place, Margaret. I cut her off smoothly. Because you are standing here discussing my professional capacity with executives from my industry. So, since we are all here, let's just clear up the financial timeline for everyone's benefit. I turned away from my mother and looked directly at the head of the real estate brokerage and the charity board members. I didn't give them a chance to look away. I asked 3 deadly, extremely specific questions. First, I said, locking eyes with the real estate broker, has the penthouse been paid for, or is the escrow frozen because the bridge loan collapsed? The broker's face turned completely white. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew the truth, but hearing it said out loud in front of the charity board was paralyzing. Second, I continued, pivoting slightly to look right at the director of the senior care fund. Where is the $2 million donation coming from? Because the old family mansion hasn't sold, the bank accounts are locked, and there is absolutely zero liquid capital available. The charity director blinked, his expression rapidly shifting from polite confusion to absolute, horrified realization. He looked from me to my mother, waiting for her to deny it. She couldn't. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. And third, I said, letting my voice drop into a cold, hard tone as I looked around the entire circle. Who said I was still overseeing the finances? Because I formally withdrew my name and my assets from all of these transactions. I do not attach my name to unfunded shell games. The whole room went completely silent. It wasn't just quiet in our circle. The silence seemed to ripple outward, infecting the nearby tables as people noticed the intense standoff. The string quartet was still playing in the background, but the lively chatter of the gala had completely evaporated around us. For the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore had absolutely nothing to say. She couldn't charm her way out of hard financial facts. She couldn't smile and wave away bank logs and legal withdrawal notices. She was standing in front of the very people she was trying to impress, completely exposed. Then, the final blow landed. A major donor, a man who had been heavily courted by my mother for years, stepped slightly forward from the edge of the circle. He looked at my mother, his face a mask of utter disgust. "Margaret," the major donor asked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence like a knife, "did you pledge the money before your family was financially stable?" My mother opened her mouth to speak, but her throat just clicked. She couldn't answer him. She couldn't spin it. Right there, in the middle of the conservatory hall, under the glittering chandeliers and surrounded by the absolute elite of Chicago society, her reputation crumbled right there in the room. The illusion was dead. The curtain had been violently pulled back, and everyone finally saw the massive, empty void where the Whitmore family fortune was supposed to be. I didn't need to stay another second. I had delivered my facts. I had protected my name. I had set the record straight. I looked at my mother one last time, turned around, and calmly walked out of the ballroom, leaving her alone in the silent, staring crowd. But of course, the fallout didn't stop at the gala. A public humiliation of that magnitude demands a private reckoning, and the real explosion was waiting for me. The fallout from the charity gala didn't wait until Monday morning. Less than 12 hours after I walked out of the conservatory hall, leaving my mother completely exposed in front of the Chicago elite, the inevitable summons finally came. Early Saturday morning, the family called me home for a final meeting. I honestly debated whether or not I should even go. Legally, I had absolutely no obligation to step foot inside that massive, suffocating house ever again. My assets were secure, my professional reputation was intact, and I had successfully severed my name from their fraudulent shell game. But a part of me, the forensic investigator part that always needs to see the final ledger balanced and the case officially closed, knew that this was the definitive end. I needed to look them in the eye one last time before the entire structure collapsed into dust. So, I drank my black coffee, grabbed my car keys, and drove up the long, perfectly manicured driveway of the $6.4 million mansion that was currently the source of all this misery. Walking through those heavy, custom-built oak front doors felt entirely different this time. For the last 10 years, I had always walked into that house as the anxious, overworked fixer, the dutiful daughter desperately trying to keep the water from breaching the hull of a sinking luxury cruise ship. Today, however, I walked in as an independent auditor viewing a completely bankrupt company. The air inside the grand foyer was thick, heavy with panic, and vibrating with unfiltered rage. I didn't even have to look for them to know where they were, because I could hear the shouting coming from down the hall. They were all waiting for me in my father's dark wood-paneled study. The moment I crossed the threshold and stepped onto the expensive Persian rug, the polite facade vanished, and the conversation instantly escalated, quickly turning into a full-blown war. There was no polite greeting, no offering of tea, and absolutely no attempt at mediation. It was just an immediate, synchronized, and vicious attack from a group of people who had finally hit rock bottom. Clara, my younger sister, was curled up in a massive leather armchair in the corner, sobbing hysterically into a designer cashmere throw blanket, her expensive mascara smeared violently down her cheeks. Her world was completely ending because the credit cards were still declining, her luxury spa appointments were canceled, and the terrifying reality of actually having to get a job and work for a living was finally staring her right in the face. My father, Daniel, was pacing back and forth behind his massive mahogany desk like a trapped, panicked animal. His usual stoic, perfectly tailored businessman persona was completely gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was a disheveled mess, and his face was flushed a deep, dangerous shade of purple with fury. Before I could even close the heavy study doors behind me, my father stopped his frantic pacing, pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face, and yelled that I had destroyed everything. The sheer volume of his voice actually rattled the expensive crystal bourbon glasses sitting on his vintage bar cart. He lunged forward, slamming both of his hands flat onto the polished surface of his desk. He screamed that the real estate broker had called him at 2 a.m. to officially terminate the penthouse contract. He shouted that the charity board had held an emergency session at dawn and formally, publicly rejected my mother's $2 million pledge. He looked at me with pure venom, blaming me entirely for their public humiliation and their sudden, catastrophic financial ruin. And I stood perfectly still just inside the doorway, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my long coat. I didn't flinch, I didn't step back, and I didn't raise my voice a single decibel to match his screaming. I didn't destroy a single thing, Dad, I replied, my voice coldly clinical and completely devoid of the guilt he was so desperately trying to trigger. Gravity destroyed it. You built a massive house out of playing cards on top of a financial sinkhole, and you were screaming at me because I finally refused to stand underneath it and hold it up with my own 2 hands. Margaret was sitting rigidly on the center leather sofa, staring blankly at the floor. She looked like she had physically aged 10 years overnight. The flawless, arrogant, untouchable society queen from the voicemail just a few days ago was completely gone. She looked hollowed out, desperate, and incredibly dangerous. When she finally lifted her head and looked up at me, her eyes were burning with a terrifying, delusional mix of elite entitlement and sheer, unadulterated hatred. And right then, in her desperate, scrambling attempt to justify the catastrophic mess she had created, my mother finally admitted the terrible truth. They had planned to use my personal money to cover their massive financial shortfalls that as a forensic finance investigator, I am highly accustomed to hearing white-collar criminals confess to complex, deeply hidden frauds, but listening to my own mother casually detail how she had fully intended to drain my personal life savings was a completely different level of chilling. In her twisted logic, she explained the actual mechanics of her grand financial scheme. She admitted that she and my father knew the bridge loan for the luxury penthouse was going to fall significantly short. They knew my father's hidden, toxic business debts were going to immediately eat up whatever small profit came from selling the old family mansion. They were millions of dollars in the hole before the ink was even dry on the real estate contracts. So, her brilliant, calculated solution to cover these massive deficits was to simply raid my accounts. She wasn't just using my spotless credit history as a background guarantor anymore. She had actively engineered the banking documents in such a way that, when the escrow inevitably ran out of funds, the bank's automated system would bypass their empty accounts and pull the remaining multi-million-dollar balance directly from my verified, personal asset portfolio. She had essentially set me up to be legally pillaged by the bank. The most horrifying part wasn't just the attempted theft, it was the absolute arrogance behind it. She didn't even ask me. She just assumed it was hers for the taking. She never sat me down and begged for a loan. She never pitched me a repayment plan. She just blindly assumed that because I was her daughter, my hard-earned money, my retirement accounts, and my decade of savings were simply an automatic extension of the Whitmore family slush fund. You were going to let the bank drain my accounts, I said softly, the horrific, cold reality of her ultimate betrayal finally settling deep into my bones. You were going to let me lose absolutely everything I have worked for, my entire life savings, just so you could host a fancy cocktail party in a penthouse overlooking the lake. It was temporary, Margaret snapped, her voice shrill, defensive, and completely devoid of any real remorse. Your father's investments were going to turn around next quarter. We just needed a temporary bridge. You have so much money just sitting there in those accounts, doing absolutely nothing. We are your family, Elena. You were supposed to step up and do your part. The absolute, unchecked delusion was staggering. She was sitting inside a $6 million mansion that was slipping through her fingers, wearing a gold Rolex, screaming at me for successfully protecting my own bank account from her blatant financial theft. She genuinely, truly believed that my sole, dedicated purpose in life was to quietly finance her extreme vanity. She stood up from the leather sofa, taking an aggressive step toward me, her face twisting into a hideous mask of ugly, desperate authority. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger right at my chest, preparing to deliver the ultimate guilt trip. She was about to say the one sentence that would completely and permanently destroy whatever tiny, microscopic shred of a relationship we had left. Margaret looked me dead in the eye and said, "You owe this family." Those 4 words hung in the dead, heavy air of the study. You owe this family. Because they generously gave me a wealthy last name. Because they raised me in a beautiful house, completely built on a foundation of lies. Because I had spent the last decade of my adult life working exhausting 60-hour weeks to fix their catastrophic mistakes, while Clara went on spontaneous shopping sprees in Milan. I looked at my mother's furious, entitled face. I looked at my red-faced, hyperventilating father. I looked at my sobbing, completely useless sister. I waited for the familiar wave of guilt, the urge to apologize, the instinct to pull out my laptop and fix the numbers. But I didn't feel anger, and I certainly didn't feel guilt. I just felt a profound, overwhelming, and incredibly freeing sense of relief. The invisible, toxic chains that had bound me to these people for 36 years just snapped. Completely and permanently I looked right back at her and replied, "I don't owe you. I am just the one cleaning up your messes." I didn't wait for her to gasp in shock. I didn't wait for my father to start yelling his empty threats again. I didn't wait for Clara to wail. I just turned around, walked out of the dark, suffocating study, and walked out the heavy oak front doors for the very last time. I didn't slam the door behind me. I just clicked it shut, walked down the driveway to my car, and drove away. The family had officially exploded, and for the first time in my entire life, I wasn't going to stick around to sweep up the broken glass. When you spend your entire professional life tracking down missing money and dismantling complex financial frauds, you learn a very hard, unavoidable truth about the nature of collapse. Ruin does not happen slowly. It doesn't gracefully walk down the stairs. When the fundamental illusion, holding a massive mountain of debt together, is finally exposed, the entire structure falls straight out of the sky. After I walked out of my parents' house that Saturday morning, leaving them screaming in the study, I didn't look back. I didn't answer any more phone calls, and I certainly didn't check my emails to see if they had magically come to their senses. I completely detached myself. But working in the same financial circles in Chicago meant that I didn't actually need to speak to my family to know exactly what was happening to them. The gossip in the high-end banking and real estate world is vicious, fast, and remarkably accurate. That IT took exactly 6 weeks for the entire Whitmore family empire to be completely and utterly erased. The first massive casualty of their sudden, brutal reality check was the lakefront property. The luxury penthouse that my mother had practically structured her entire future identity around was officially pulled from their grasp. Because the bridge loan was permanently frozen, and I had legally removed my financial backing, they were an absolute, unrecoverable breach of contract. The sellers didn't even give them the dignity of a grace period to scramble for new funding. They immediately terminated the escrow, kept the initial deposit as a penalty, and within just a few weeks, the penthouse was sold to someone else entirely. I heard through a colleague that a young tech billionaire from California bought it in straight cash. My mother had to suffer the absolute indignity of driving past that beautiful, towering glass building on Lake Michigan, knowing that someone else was sleeping in her dream home, hosting the lavish parties she had already sent out save-the-date cards for, but losing the penthouse was just a bruised ego. The real, catastrophic financial damage came from the old family property. They were still desperately trying to sell our massive, outdated $6.4 million mansion. The problem with selling luxury real estate is that the moment the market smells desperation, the sharks begin to circle. And my parents were practically bleeding in the water. Because they had no liquid cash, maxed out credit, and creditors suddenly breathing down their necks from all directions, they couldn't afford to let the house sit on the market and wait for a fair offer. They needed cash immediately just to keep themselves out of default. The luxury brokers knew this. The buyers knew this. So, they were forced into a corner and had to accept a brutal, deeply insulting lowball cash offer. The house eventually sold for a staggering $1.8 million, less than they had originally anticipated. For a normal family, taking a hit on a real estate sale is painful. But for my father, Daniel Whitmore, that $1.8 million deficit was the absolute fatal blow to his entire secret financial existence. He had been heavily relying on that specific chunk of equity to quietly pay off the massive, toxic business debts he had been hiding from the world for years. When that money vanished from the ledger, his protective walls completely evaporated. The private lenders and the corporate creditors didn't care about his bespoke suits or his tough guy businessman persona. They wanted their money, and they wanted it right then. He was suddenly facing total, unmitigated bankruptcy and potentially severe legal action for the way he had been shuffling funds around. To avoid going to federal court, my father was forced to immediately liquidate his assets. He had to sell his small company entirely just to cover the massive debts he had accumulated. The business he had spent his entire adult life building, the company that gave him his title and his arrogant authority, was stripped away and sold for parts. He went from being a proud, wealthy CEO to an unemployed man drowning in leftover liabilities in a matter of weeks. While my father was watching his professional life burn to the ground, my younger sister, Clara, was experiencing her own deeply personal, incredibly harsh introduction to the real world. Clara had spent her entire life treating our family's wealth as her own personal, bottomless ATM. She funded her designer wardrobe, her spontaneous European vacations, and her luxury spa days on credit cards that she never even looked at. Naturally, her social circle and her romantic life were built entirely around that same fake, superficial wealth. She had been dating a high-powered investment banker who loved having a beautiful, supposedly rich girl on his arm. But investment bankers know how to read a balance sheet. The absolute second the rumors started circulating that the Whitmore family was completely broke, he dropped her. Clara was dumped by her boyfriend the moment the terrifying reality of her massive credit card debt was exposed. He didn't want a partner. He wanted an accessory, and a broke accessory with zero life skills and hundreds of thousands of dollars in unsecured personal debt was a terrible investment. For the first time in her 32 years of life, Clara was entirely alone, without a man to buy her dinners, without a father to pay her rent, and without a sister to magically wipe out her credit card statements. But out of everyone in the family, the ultimate, most devastating punishment landed squarely on my mother, Margaret. For her, money was just a tool. Her true currency was social status. She thrived on the applause, the jealousy, and the admiration of the Chicago elite. She genuinely believed she was untouchable. But high society is incredibly unforgiving when you embarrass them, and she had committed the ultimate sin. She had made the charity board look stupid. After the disastrous gala at the Conservatory Hall, where she was publicly caught lying about the $2 million pledge and my supposed financial backing, the fallout was swift and completely merciless. The high-end senior care fund held an emergency executive session. They formally canceled her highly publicized pledge, completely distancing their organization from our family name. But they didn't stop there. In a quiet, devastatingly polite email, Margaret was officially voted out and removed from the charity board entirely. She was exiled. The very people she had spent decades kissing up to, the wealthy women she hosted at our home, the local politicians she took photos with, they all collectively turned their backs on her. Her phone stopped ringing with invitations to exclusive luncheons. She was no longer welcome at the galas. She became a complete social pariah in the only world she ever actually cared about. Over those 6 weeks, I watched all of this unfold from the quiet, safe distance of my own apartment. I didn't interfere. I didn't offer to negotiate with my father's creditors. I didn't send Clara any money for rent, and I didn't call the charity board to beg for mercy for my mother. I just sat at my kitchen table, drank my coffee, and watched the math finally balance itself out. I didn't feel a sick sense of joy or a petty thrill of revenge. I just felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of validation. I had spent 10 agonizing years believing that I was the problem, that I wasn't doing enough, that I just needed to work a little harder to keep them all happy and afloat, but the truth was finally out in the open, undeniable and absolute. They had destroyed themselves. The moment I simply stopped artificially propping up their massive, arrogant lies, gravity did exactly what it was always going to do. While my father was liquidating his business to pay off secret debts, my sister was crying over her canceled credit cards, and my mother was hiding from the society ladies who had permanently exiled her. There was one person left in the wreckage who actually mattered. Amidst all the screaming, the bankruptcies, and the dramatic public humiliations, my family had completely forgotten about the one innocent casualty caught in the crossfire of their massive financial shell game. My grandmother, Eleanor Grant, if you remember, my mother, Margaret, had spent the last 6 months parading Grandma Eleanor around Chicago like a show dog. She had used her own mother as the emotional prop for that fraudulent $2 million pledge to the high-end senior care fund. Margaret loved wheeling Eleanor into charity board meetings, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, and giving passionate speeches about the importance of elder care. It was a fantastic performance that guaranteed her front-page coverage in the local society papers. But the absolute second that the pledge was publicly rejected and Margaret was violently kicked off the charity board, her profound, public passion for senior care completely evaporated. Suddenly, Grandma Eleanor was no longer a useful asset. She was a liability. She was a quiet, fragile reminder of the massive public humiliation my mother had just endured. And because my parents were being forced to sell the $6.4 million mansion for a devastating $1.8 million loss just to avoid federal court, they were packing up their lives in a frantic, terrifying rush. They had no time, no money, and absolutely no patience to deal with an elderly woman who required daily assistance. My mother, in her infinite selfishness, was actually discussing putting Eleanor in the cheapest, state-run overflow facility she could find, simply because she couldn't afford the luxury options anymore and didn't want the daily burden of taking care of her own mother. That was where I finally drew the line. I had sworn off my parents, and I had permanently severed my financial ties with my sister, but I was never going to abandon my grandmother. I am a forensic finance investigator, which means I know exactly how to legally extract assets from a sinking ship before the creditors freeze everything. I didn't wait for my parents to make a disastrous decision. I just stepped in and took over. I didn't call Margaret to ask for permission. I didn't coordinate with my father. I went straight to the family lawyer, Robert Langford, the same man who had watched my mother's lies unravel, and I had him draft an immediate transfer of medical and financial power of attorney for Eleanor. Because my parents were completely drowning in legal threats and bankruptcy filings, they didn't even put up a fight. They signed the paperwork without reading it, probably relieved that someone else was taking the problem off their hands. The second the ink was dry, I went to the massive, half-empty mansion, packed up my grandmother's belongings, and drove her away from that toxic, collapsing environment forever. That I didn't take her to the ultra-luxury, high-end facility my mother had tried to illegally buy her way into. That place was a superficial country club that cared more about donor plaques and gala invitations than actual human beings. Instead, I spent weeks personally researching, touring, and vetting places. I used the money I had carefully saved, the exact same personal savings my mother had brutally planned to drain to cover her own debts, to secure Grandma Eleanor a spot in a modest but deeply decent nursing home located in a quiet, tree-lined suburb just outside the city. It wasn't a place that would ever be featured in a Chicago society magazine. There were no imported orchids in the lobby, no string quartets playing in the dining room, and absolutely no charity galas hosted in the courtyard. It was just safe. It was incredibly clean. The nursing staff was genuinely warm and attentive, and the rooms were filled with natural sunlight. It was a place designed for living a quiet, dignified life, not for showing off fake wealth to strangers. The day I moved her into her new room was the first time I had felt my chest completely unclench in 10 years. I unpacked her favorite knitted blankets, set up the framed photographs of our ancestors on her small wooden nightstand, and arranged a simple vase of fresh daisies by the window. Eleanor sat in a comfortable armchair, watching me work with a soft, peaceful smile on her face. She was sharp enough to know that everything had gone terribly wrong with my parents, even if she didn't know the exact dollar amounts or the legal complexities of the fraud. She knew the mansion was gone, she knew Margaret was furious, and she knew I had walked away. When I finally finished unpacking, I sat down on the edge of her bed and poured us both a cup of tea from a small thermos I had brought. The room was perfectly quiet. There was no screaming from down the hall, no frantic phone calls from creditors, and no panic about declining credit cards. "It's very quiet here, Elena," my grandmother said softly, her frail hands wrapping around the warm teacup. She looked around the modest room, her eyes resting on the simple, clean walls. "I know, Grandma," I replied, taking a slow sip of my tea. "Do you like it?" She nodded slowly, a deep, profound sense of relief washing over her wrinkled face. I was so tired of all the noise at the big house. Margaret was always shouting about money. Your father was always pacing. It felt like living inside a thunderstorm. But this is nice. She looked at me, really looked at me, with the kind of unconditional love I hadn't received from a family member in over a decade. She reached out and gently patted my knee. "You did a good thing, Elena," she whispered. "You saved yourself, and you saved me." I felt a tight lump form in my throat, but I didn't cry. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel the suffocating, heavy burden of being the Whitmore family fixer. I hadn't paid off a massive toxic debt, I hadn't committed bank fraud to secure a luxury penthouse, and I hadn't covered up a massive public lie. I had simply done what was actually right. I had protected the only person in my family who genuinely deserved protection, and I had done it honestly, cleanly, and without a single ounce of drama. Over the next few months, I visited Grandma Eleanor every single Sunday. We would sit in the small, sunlit garden of the nursing home, drink tea, and talk about absolutely nothing important. We never talked about Margaret. We never talked about Daniel. We never brought up Clara's tragic new reality of having to work a minimum wage retail job just to pay off her staggering credit card bills. We just existed in a state of total, uninterrupted peace. Eleanor made friends with the other residents. She joined a weekly reading group, and she finally looked relaxed. She wasn't a prop anymore. She was just a grandmother enjoying her final years in a safe, caring environment at AS. The harsh Chicago winter slowly began to fade, melting the snow and making way for the early signs of spring. I realized that my life had completely transformed. The 43 missed calls were a distant memory. The vicious rumors from the charity board had faded into old news. The financial algorithms at the hospital where I worked continued to run smoothly, and my professional reputation as a forensic investigator remained absolutely spotless. The system that had demanded my constant, exhausting sacrifice had completely destroyed itself, just like I knew it would. And from those ashes, I was finally building something real. By the time the harsh, freezing Chicago winter finally broke and the spring of the following year arrived, my life had become completely unrecognizable. The frantic, screaming chaos that had defined my existence for so long was entirely gone. I didn't wake up to panicked text messages about overdrawn accounts, and I didn't spend my lunch breaks at the hospital secretly moving money around to cover up my parents' massive financial shortfalls. Instead, I just woke up, drank my coffee, went to work as a forensic finance investigator, and lived a completely normal, painfully ordinary life. For the first time, my financial skills were strictly reserved for the large medical funds that actually paid my salary, not for a family trying to desperately fund a multi-million-dollar illusion. On a bright, clear Tuesday morning in late April, I walked into a very standard, incredibly boring real estate attorney's office in downtown Chicago. I wasn't there to untangle a catastrophic legal mess. I wasn't there to face down highly paid lawyers like Robert Langford to explain why a luxury escrow was completely empty. I was simply there to sign the final closing documents to buy my very first apartment. It wasn't a sweeping, multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, and it certainly wasn't a massive $6.4 million mansion with a custom oak driveway. It was just a modest, sensible, two-bedroom condo located in a quiet, safe neighborhood. But to me, it was the most valuable piece of real estate in the entire world, because every single penny used to purchase it was real. That I sat across the desk from the closing agent, picked up a standard blue pen, and began to sign my name on the dotted lines. As I carefully signed document after document, I could not help but think about the sheer volume of fraudulent, high-risk paperwork I had been guilt-tripped into signing over the years for my parents. For a decade, my spotless credit history, my verified assets, and my personal signature were used as tools to aggressively prop up my father's hidden corporate debts and my mother's delusional charity gala fantasies. Every time I signed a document for them, I felt a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest, knowing I was legally tying myself to people who would gladly let me go bankrupt just to maintain their social status. But this time, looking at the mortgage documents for my new condo, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of lightness. There were no hidden liabilities. There were no fake bridge loans waiting to collapse. There was no secret deficit that I would magically have to cover at the last minute. It was just my income, my savings, and my future. The room was entirely quiet as I handed the signed paperwork back to the agent. I looked around the small office and realized just how beautifully empty it was. There was absolutely no family standing behind me to claim credit for my success. There was no father pacing the room demanding things be done faster, no sister complaining about the lack of luxury, and no mother trying to turn the moment into a photo opportunity for the local society pages. There was absolutely no drama in that room. It was just me, completing a normal transaction. I took a deep breath, handed over the final check, and accepted the keys to my new home. As the metal keys dropped into the palm of my hand, I realized that the specific, boring, completely unbothered quietness was exactly what I had spent the last 20 years of my life trying to win back. Since I was 16 years old, I had been the designated adult in the Whitmore family. I was the one who balanced the checkbooks, managed the crises, and shielded them from the brutal consequences of their own financial recklessness. I sacrificed 20 years of my own peace of mind to serve as a human shield for a family that viewed me strictly as a utility. Now, at 36 years old, I was finally, permanently freed, and I still drive out to the suburbs every single Sunday to visit my grandmother, Eleanor. The modest nursing home I moved her into is completely stable, very safe, and filled with incredibly kind people. It is not the extremely expensive, elite facility my mother tried to use as a prop for her fake $2 million pledge. It is just a decent, quiet place where my grandmother can actually relax. She looks healthier now than she has in years. We sit in the courtyard, we drink tea, and we never mention the people we left behind. We don't talk about my mother being exiled from the charity board, and we don't talk about my father losing his business. We just enjoy the sun. Sometimes, people in my professional circle who know the rumors about what happened to the Whitmore family will approach me. They look at me with a strange mixture of caution and respect, assuming that I am some kind of cold, calculating mastermind. Because I am a forensic investigator, they assume I actively engineered my family's total financial ruin. They think I gathered the evidence, set a trap at that charity gala, and maliciously burned my parents' entire empire to the ground as payback for the terrible voicemail my mother left me that October night. But I always stop them right there because they completely miss the point of everything that happened. This entire situation, from the very first frozen bank account to the very last unpaid credit card, was absolutely not about taking revenge on my family. I didn't steal a single dollar from them. I didn't force the bank to cancel their loans. I didn't tell the charity board to reject my mother's pledge, and I didn't force my father's creditors to finally collect their debts. I didn't do any of those things. I didn't build the fraudulent financial structure they were living in. I just refused to legally co-sign it anymore. That is the absolute truth about people who build their entire existence on lies, fake wealth, and the constant exploitation of the people around them. You do not actually need to fight them. You do not need to plot an elaborate, dramatic revenge scheme to ruin their lives. You just need to walk away. When the person who always fixes everything, the person who constantly absorbs the damage and cleans up the mess, simply stops doing it, the fake system will collapse entirely on its own. It is just basic financial gravity that I didn't destroy my family. My mother told me I was no longer a part of the family, and she explicitly instructed me not to call them again. All I did was listen to her. I unplugged myself from their incredibly toxic machine. I protected the only innocent person left in the wreckage, and I let the absolute truth handle the rest. I drove to my new apartment, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The condo was completely empty, smelling faintly of fresh paint and clean wood floors. I locked the door behind me, set my bag on the kitchen counter, and listened to the total, absolute silence of my own home. I didn't owe anyone anything. The case was permanently closed.